On a frozen Chicago road, a luxury car hit a family and vanished into the night. What it left behind was not just blood in the snow, but a test of faith. A retired Navy SEAL driving a taxi saw it all. He could drive away. No one would blame him. But walking away would cost him his soul. What happened next was not an accident. It was a moment where God asked one broken man to save another broken life. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from and subscribe for more stories of faith, courage, and the miracles God hides in the darkest places. A winter night in Chicago folded the streets into silence, where falling snow erased footprints as quickly as it revealed truths, and a yellow taxi cut a thin line of light through the cold. Jack Miller drove to stay awake. That was the simplest truth he could tolerate. If he stopped, if he let the engine idle too long, or the city lull him into stillness, sleep would come, and with it the old film reel that never jammed. Faces, sounds, orders that arrived too late. So he drove the night shift when the city thinned and the past kept a polite distance. The meter ticked. The heater sighed. Snow tapped the windshield with a persistence that felt personal. He was on his way to pick up a fare near the river when the road ahead suddenly flashed white, headlights flaring, tires hissing on ice. A black luxury sedan surged past the intersection, too fast for the weather, too clean for the neighborhood. Jack felt the reflex before he named it, a tightening in his chest, the old readiness that had nothing to do with driving. Then came the sound. It wasn't loud, it wasn't cinematic. It was the dull, terrible thump of weight meeting metal, followed by a brief, sickening skid. The sedan fishtailed, corrected, and vanished into the snow without slowing. Jack's foot hit the brake. The taxi shuddered to a stop. For a moment he sat there, hands locked on the wheel, breath held in the small, bright cage of the cab. He waited for sirens that didn't come, for witnesses that didn't appear, for his heart to obey the weather and calm down. Nothing moved. He got out. Cold cut through his jacket like it had a purpose. The streetlight above flickered, throwing shadows that made the scene feel unreal, like a memory he hadn't earned. Near the curb lay the aftermath. A large dog motionless in the snow, the shape already wrong in a way Jack recognized without analysis. A few feet beyond, another dog lay on her side, dark spreading beneath her, breath shallow and ragged. Two small shapes pressed against her belly, trembling, blind to anything but warmth. Jack swore softly. The word was a habit, not anger. This wasn't his problem, said the voice that had learned survival the hard way. Call it in. Get back in the car. Let the system do what it does. That voice was persuasive because it sounded reasonable. Another voice, older, deeper, cut across it. You saw it. That was enough. He knelt, snow soaking through his jeans, and the cold brought him back to places he didn't keep words for. The mother dog's eyes tracked him. Not fear exactly, calculation. A warning that didn't need volume. She tried to shift, to put herself between him and the small bodies at her side, but her legs refused. The effort cost her. She whimpered once, then clenched her jaw as if ashamed of the sound. I'm not here to hurt you, Jack said, because silence felt like abandonment. His voice came out steady. He noticed that, filed it away like a minor miracle. He pulled his phone, out with numb fingers, and called it in. Hit and run injured animals. Location. The dispatcher's voice was apologetic, distant, realistic about response times in a snowstorm. Jack thanked her and ended the call. He knew what as soon as possible meant. The smaller shapes stirred. One of them made a thin sound that barely existed. Jack's throat tightened. He reached for his jacket without deciding to. The motion was automatic, like muscle memory reclaiming territory. He moved slowly, narrating his actions the way he'd learned to do when everything else went sideways. Jacket off. Wrap the pups first. Keep them warm. The mother dog tensed when he touched the puppies, teeth bared in a last defense, but she didn't snap. She watched him with an intensity that burned. Jack met her gaze and held it. Not a challenge, a promise. "Easy," he said. "I've got them." He wrapped the puppies, tucked them against his chest, and stood. The wind slapped him for his trouble. He walked back to the taxi, opened the rear door, and laid the small bundle on the seat, turning the heater higher until it protested. Then he returned for the mother. Lifting her was harder. Not the weight, he'd carried heavier burdens, but the way her body gave, the way her breath stuttered against his arm. She smelled of blood and cold, and something else Jack recognized. Refusal. The kind that doesn't argue, the kind that endures. As he carried her, she went still, conserving what little she had left. He set her on the front passenger seat, adjusting her gently, talking the whole time because quiet was dangerous. He buckled the belt across her middle with care. It felt absurd and necessary. Back behind the wheel, Jack's hands shook. He forced them steady. He checked the mirror, the road, the clock. The city was a map he knew even when it was erased. He pulled out, tires finding purchase, and drove. The heater roared. The smell of wet wool and iron filled the cab. The puppies whimpered, then quieted as warmth reached them. Jack kept his eyes forward. He didn't trust himself to look back too often. At the first long stretch of empty road, one of the puppies stopped making noise. Jack felt it before he heard, or didn't hear, anything. He pulled over hard, hazards blinking like a confession. He climbed into the back seat, cradled the small body, and searched for signs he was afraid to name. The puppy was too still. "Okay," Jack said, and the word became an anchor. Okay. He worked with the calm he'd practiced in worse places, hands careful, breath measured. He counted because counting kept the panic out of the room. He pressed, eased, breathed, waited. Snow piled on the windshield, the world narrowing to the space between his hands and the fragile life there. When the puppy gasped, barely, stubbornly, Jack laughed and sobbed at the same time, the sounds colliding in his chest. He pressed the small body back against warmth and sat there for a moment longer than he should have, forehead against the seat, letting the feeling pass without naming it. He got them moving again. By the time the clinic lights cut through the storm, Jack's jaw ached from clenching. He carried the mother inside, voice hoarse but controlled, and set her where the staff directed. He stepped back when told. He waited when there was nothing else to do. At one point, the room went quiet, in a way Jack knew too well. He stared at a monitor that flattened and felt something old rear up, feral and hot. He leaned forward, palms on the counter, and spoke to no one in particular. "Don't," he said. It wasn't a command. It was a plea he'd sworn never to make again. The line wavered. A beat returned. The room exhaled. Jack closed his eyes and opened them again, accepting the present like a truce. When it was over, when the mother breathed on her own and the puppy slept in a warm box, Jack finally sat. His hands wouldn't stop shaking. He let them. He stared at the floor and thought about the sedan disappearing into the snow, about how easy it was to leave damage behind when you drove fast enough. He also thought about staying. As the night thinned toward morning, officials arrived with clipboards and rules. Jack listened. He nodded. He understood the words even when they landed like weights. Quarantine, observation, procedure. When they moved the mother onto a transport stretcher, she lifted her head and found him with her eyes. Not gratitude, recognition. Jack stepped closer without asking permission and rested his hand where she could feel it. "I'll be here," he said, and surprised himself by believing it. Outside, the taxi waited, yellow against the snow, engine ticking as it cooled. Jack stood between the doors for a moment, breath fogging, and felt the city shift. He didn't know what came next. He only knew what he had chosen. Tonight, he had not driven away. Morning crept into the veterinary clinic through frosted glass, pale and uncertain, as machines hummed softly and the city outside pretended the night's violence had never happened. Jack Miller did not sleep. He sat in a molded plastic chair that pinched the backs of his legs and stared at the red exit sign across the hall as if it were a landmark he might someday reach. Every few minutes he rubbed his hands together, not for warmth, but to make sure they still belonged to him. The smell of disinfectant, mixed with wet fur and old blood, clung to the air sharp enough to cut through exhaustion. He had been offered coffee. He had declined. Staying sharp felt safer than being comforted. Through the narrow observation window, the mother dog lay under blankets and wires, chest rising with effort, the rhythm uneven but present. Each rise felt like a negotiation with something Jack had spent years trying not to name. He told himself to breathe when she breathed, a habit learned long ago when counting breaths meant staying alive. He tried not to think about how natural that instinct still felt. A technician passed, nodded, said nothing. Silence had weight here. It pressed down, filling the spaces where explanations would usually live. Jack welcomed it because explanations always arrived too late. His phone buzzed once in his pocket. He didn't check it. He knew who it would be and what they would ask, and he did not have the language to answer without sounding like a stranger to himself. He leaned back, closed his eyes for a fraction of a second, and the image of headlights on snow flared uninvited. He opened them immediately. Not today. He stood and paced the hallway, boots whispering against the floor, keeping his movements measured. Control mattered. Control was the line between here and elsewhere. When the door to the treatment room opened, a veterinarian stepped out, spoke quietly, used careful words about stabilization and risk. Jack nodded, absorbing the facts without comment. He had learned how to receive bad news without letting it touch his face. When asked about ownership, about paperwork, about next steps, Jack answered what he could and admitted what he didn't know. The question of the hit and run hung between them like an unfinished sentence. Police would follow up, reports would be filed. Jack listened and felt the familiar irritation rise, not at the process, but at the certainty that it would not restore anything that had been broken. He signed where indicated and waited again. Time moved differently now. It stretched and compressed, looping back on itself. He thought of the taxi idling outside, of the fare he never picked up, of how easily a night could split into before and after. He wondered if the driver of the sedan felt anything when they drove away, or if the speed itself had erased consequence. The puppies slept in a warmed enclosure nearby, their small sounds barely audible, but Jack felt them like a tether. Every time one stirred, his shoulders loosened a fraction. When a nurse asked him to sit while animal control was notified, Jack's jaw tightened. He understood the rules. Quarantine existed for reasons that did not care about intention. He also understood what it meant to have something taken away for safety, to be told it was procedure, not punishment. A uniformed officer arrived, efficient and polite, clipboard balanced against a forearm, eyes moving from Jack to the window to the floor. Questions were asked, answers were given. The word temporary was used more than once. Jack focused on it like a talisman. Temporary meant there was still a next step. When they brought the mother dog out on a rolling stretcher, Jack felt the room tilt. She turned her head despite sedation, eyes searching until they found him. There was no fear in that look. There was expectation. Jack moved closer, ignoring the officer's raised brow, and placed his hand where she could feel it. He did not speak. He didn't trust his voice. Her breathing steadied just enough to register. The officer cleared his throat and explained the transport, the facility, the time frame. Jack listened and nodded again, but the words slid off him, secondary to the fact that she had looked for him and found him. As they wheeled her away, the hallway felt longer than it should have. The door closed. The sound lingered. Jack stood there, hands empty, and the emptiness roared. He forced himself to walk back to the waiting area and sit. He did not chase. Chasing had cost him too much in other lives. Instead, he sat and counted the seconds between the hums of the machine, grounding himself in the present. When the puppies were transferred as well, Jack followed until he was asked to stop. He stopped. He watched. He committed their absence to memory the way he had learned to memorize rooms he might never leave. Outside, daylight revealed a city scrubbed clean by snow. Jack stepped into the cold and felt it bite. The taxi was where he left it, a small mercy. He sat in the driver's seat and rested his forehead against the wheel. He did not pray. He made a promise instead, quiet and unadorned, the kind meant to be kept even if no one else ever knew. He would show up. He would not disappear when things grew complicated. The engine turned over. The meter blinked awake. As Jack pulled into traffic, he checked the mirror and caught his own eyes. They looked different, not healed, not resolved, but anchored. Somewhere between the clinic and the street, a line had been drawn. He did not yet know who would test it or how. He only knew that the night had not taken everything. As he drove, his phone buzzed again. This time he answered, listening without interrupting, choosing his words with care. When the call ended, he merged onto the expressway and headed home, snow falling lighter now, as if the storm were reconsidering. Behind him, somewhere beyond rules and waiting periods, something watched the road and remembered his voice. Snow lingered on Chicago's sidewalks as winter settled deeper, and time inside the quarantine facility moved with a slow, deliberate patience that tested every promise made in the dark. Jack Miller learned the route by heart after the third visit. The turns, the lights, the long stretch of road where the city thinned into something quieter. He drove there after his night shifts, sometimes still smelling faintly of coffee and cold vinyl, sometimes with hands that ached from gripping the steering wheel too long. The quarantine building was plain, functional, designed to reduce risk rather than inspire hope. Jack respected that. He had lived most of his life in places built the same way. Inside, the rules were simple and unyielding. Limited time, no sudden movements. Let the staff lead. Jack followed them without complaint, because discipline had taught him when obedience mattered. When he was finally led to the enclosure, he stopped just inside the threshold and waited, letting his presence announce itself before his body did. The mother dog lifted her head. The recognition was immediate and unsettling in its clarity. Jack felt it land somewhere behind his ribs, a reminder that bonds did not require language. She shifted, careful, watching him with eyes that held neither gratitude nor submission, but something harder to name: assessment, memory, expectation. Jack crouched, lowering himself to her level, and spoke quietly, the tone he used when volume would only invite chaos. He told her nothing important, just that he was there, that the weather was holding, that the city was still loud. He told her the kind of things one says to prove continuity. The staff watched closely, surprised by the absence of aggression. Jack felt the familiar tension between control and trust stretch thin and hold. He noticed how his breathing slowed to match hers, how his thoughts arranged themselves into clean lines when he focused on her presence rather than his own noise. On the walk back to the car, a caseworker explained timelines and evaluations, spoke of behavior markers and risk thresholds. Jack listened, nodding, understanding every word and none of the outcome. At home, sleep came in fragments. Dreams arrived anyway. He woke before dawn, heart racing, then steadied himself with routine. He cleaned the taxi, he folded laundry, he returned calls he had ignored. Each small act felt like reinforcement against a larger collapse. On his next visit, he brought nothing with him, not even hope. He brought consistency instead. Again, the dog responded with calm, with attention, with restraint that surprised the observers. Jack saw the looks exchanged behind clipboards and felt something unfamiliar stir, cautious and unwelcome. Possibility. He did not reach for it. Possibility had a habit of asking for payment later. When the staff asked him to step back and give a simple command, Jack hesitated only long enough to consider the weight of it. He spoke once. The dog complied without hesitation, not because she had been trained, but because she chose alignment over resistance. The room changed. Jack felt it like a shift in pressure. On the drive home, he replayed the moment and tried to dismantle it into explanations he could trust. Trauma bonds, situational compliance, coincidence. None of them satisfied. That night, as snow began again, Jack parked the taxi and sat with the engine off, listening to the quiet. He thought about names and dismissed the thought as premature. He thought about promises and recognized the danger there. Yet, when he closed his eyes, he saw her standing her ground, and the image did not bring panic. It brought focus. Somewhere between regulation and instinct, a path was opening, narrow and conditional, and Jack knew that soon someone would ask him whether he was willing to walk it. Winter tightened its grip on Chicago as the quarantine clock kept counting down, each day quieter than the last, each decision growing heavier in the space Jack Miller refused to abandon. Jack stopped marking the days somewhere between routine and fatigue. Numbers had lost their usefulness. What mattered was rhythm. Drive the night shift. Visit the facility when permitted. Go home. Repeat. The structure kept his mind from slipping into places that did not forgive wandering. At the quarantine center, the staff no longer watched him with suspicion, but with caution, sharpened by interest. They spoke to him in lower voices now, as if volume alone might fracture the fragile calm that had settled whenever he entered the enclosure. The dog rose when he appeared, not in excitement, not in fear, but with intent. Jack recognized that posture. He had worn it himself in other lives, in other uniforms, ready but restrained. During one visit, a sudden noise echoed down the corridor, metal on metal, sharp and accidental. The dog's body reacted before thought, muscles coiling, breath catching, a warning rising from somewhere old and unhealed. Jack felt his own pulse spike in response, the echo of an explosion remembered rather than recalled. He did not move. He did not raise his voice. He grounded himself in stillness and waited. Slowly, the tension bled away. The dog settled. The observers wrote something down. Jack noticed his hands were steady. That surprised him more than the outcome. Later, a supervisor explained the reality with professional gentleness. There had been an incident weeks earlier, unrelated but relevant, one that made the administration wary of risk. Liability was a word that carried teeth. Jack listened without interrupting. He knew what it meant to be judged not by intent, but by potential damage. He had lived under that weight before. When the question finally came, it was framed carefully, like an offer that knew its own danger. Would he consider involvement beyond visitation if it became an option? Jack did not answer immediately. He drove afterward without music, the city sliding past in gray and white. He thought about what involvement demanded, responsibility without distance, consequences that could not be shared. He thought about the ease of walking away, about how survival had once depended on leaving things behind quickly and without sentiment. That night, sleep came harder than usual. When it did, it brought the old images again, fractured and loud. Jack woke before dawn, breath ragged, and sat on the edge of the bed until the room returned. By the next visit, the decision had not clarified, but the question had rooted itself. The dog met him with the same steady focus, as if nothing outside the enclosure mattered. Jack realized then that whatever path opened next would not ask for heroics. It would ask for consistency, for presence without escape. As he left, the supervisor mentioned evaluations, programs, words that hinted at structure where chaos usually lived. Jack nodded, non-committal, and stepped back into the cold. The city went on. The clock kept counting, and somewhere between the rules and the waiting, the margin for walking away grew thinner. Late winter pressed against the city as thaw threatened the edges of snowbanks, and the small house Jack returned to each morning began to feel less like shelter and more like a proving ground. Jack Miller discovered quickly that bringing the dog home did not quiet the noise in his head, it rearranged it. The house was still, too still at first, every sound amplified by the expectation that something would go wrong. He set rules the way he always had when uncertainty pressed close. Wake early, move deliberately, keep hands visible. The dog watched him with a focus that was not obedience but calibration, as if mapping the boundaries of a new terrain. Jack felt the familiar urge to over-control rise and forced it down, reminding himself that discipline without trust was just another kind of fear. The first nights were the hardest. Sleep came shallow and brittle, interrupted by memories that arrived without invitation. When Jack startled awake, the dog rose too, not in alarm, but in readiness, placing herself between him and the door, as if the past might break in, wearing familiar boots. Jack breathed through it, grounding himself in the present, counting the seconds until the surge passed. He learned to speak softly in those moments, not commands, just acknowledgments, and the dog learned that stillness could be an answer. Training sessions followed a rhythm that felt earned rather than imposed, simple cues, clear expectations, long pauses. Jack noticed how his own hand steadied when he focused on consistency rather than outcome. There were setbacks. A dropped pan sent both of them into a spike of tension, muscles coiling, breath shortening, old reflexes flaring. Jack stopped where he was and waited. He let the moment resolve itself without force. When it did, the quiet felt different, not empty, but shared. Outside, neighbors passed with polite distance, curious but cautious, and Jack kept his world small by choice. He drove fewer hours, choosing rest over distraction, presence over avoidance. In the evenings, he sat at the kitchen table with paperwork spread out, reading terms he could not soften, liability written in language that did not care about intention. He signed where required, understanding that responsibility was not a gesture, but a contract. As the weeks went on, the dog's attention sharpened, not toward threats, but toward Jack himself, reading his posture, responding to the subtle shifts he had once learned to hide. He realized with a start that she was teaching him as much as he was teaching her, mirroring restraint back to him when his patience thinned. On a walk after dusk, the city quiet and damp with meltwater, a distant siren rose and fell. Jack felt the familiar tightening and reached for breath. The dog matched his pace and stayed with him, not pulling ahead, not lagging behind, anchoring him to the moment. He stopped under a streetlight and rested a hand against her shoulder, not to reassure her, but to remind himself that he was here, now, and capable. The thought surprised him. Capability had felt theoretical for a long time. As winter loosened its grip, Jack understood that this was not recovery as he had imagined it, not a return to who he had been, but an alignment with who he could still become. He did not know how the city would test that alignment, or how quickly, only that tests always came when one believed the worst had passed. Late winter pressed against the city as thaw threatened the edges of snowbanks, and the small house Jack returned to each morning began to feel less like shelter and more like a proving ground. Jack Miller discovered quickly that bringing the dog home did not quiet the noise in his head. It rearranged it. The house was still, too still at first, every sound amplified by the expectation that something would go wrong. He set rules the way he always had when uncertainty pressed close. Wake early, move deliberately, keep hands visible. The dog watched him with a focus that was not obedience but calibration, as if mapping the boundaries of a new terrain. Jack felt the familiar urge to over-control rise and forced it down, reminding himself that discipline without trust was just another kind of fear. The first nights were the hardest. Sleep came shallow and brittle, interrupted by memories that arrived without invitation. When Jack startled awake, the dog rose too, not in alarm, but in readiness, placing herself between him and the door, as if the past might break in, wearing familiar boots. Jack breathed through it, grounding himself in the present, counting the seconds until the surge passed. He learned to speak softly in those moments, not commands, just acknowledgments. And the dog learned that stillness could be an answer. Training sessions followed a rhythm that felt earned rather than imposed. Simple cues, clear expectations, long pauses. Jack noticed how his own hand steadied when he focused on consistency rather than outcome. There were setbacks. A dropped pan sent both of them into a spike of tension, muscles coiling, breath shortening, old reflexes flaring. Jack stopped where he was and waited. He let the moment resolve itself without force. When it did, the quiet felt different. Not empty, but shared. Outside, neighbors passed with polite distance, curious but cautious, and Jack kept his world small by choice. He drove fewer hours, choosing rest over distraction, presence over avoidance. In the evenings, he sat at the kitchen table with paperwork spread out, reading terms he could not soften, liability written in language that did not care about intention. He signed where required, understanding that responsibility was not a gesture, but a contract. As the weeks went on, the dog's attention sharpened, not toward threats, but toward Jack himself, reading his posture, responding to the subtle shifts he had once learned to hide. He realized with a start that she was teaching him as much as he was teaching her, mirroring restraint back to him when his patience thinned. On a walk after dusk, the city quiet and damp with meltwater, a distant siren rose and fell. Jack felt the familiar tightening and reached for breath. The dog matched his pace and stayed with him, not pulling ahead, not lagging behind, anchoring him to the moment. He stopped under a streetlight and rested a hand against her shoulder, not to reassure her, but to remind himself that he was here now and capable. The thought surprised him. Capability had felt theoretical for a long time. As winter loosened its grip, Jack understood that this was not recovery as he had imagined it, not a return to who he had been, but an alignment with who he could still become. He did not know how the city would test that alignment or how quickly, only that tests always came when one believed the worst had passed. Late winter pressed against Chicago with a tired persistence, and inside the quarantine facility, the air felt charged, as if decisions long delayed were finally ready to surface. Jack Miller sensed the shift before anyone spoke it aloud. It was there in the way the staff no longer watched him from the corners of their eyes, in the way conversations stopped when he entered and then resumed with a different weight once he passed. On that morning, the snow outside had softened into a dull gray slush, and the world seemed undecided about whether to thaw or harden again. Jack signed in, washed his hands, and followed the familiar corridor, heart steady, mind guarded. When he reached the enclosure, the dog was already on her feet, alert without tension, attention fixed on him, as if he were the only constant in a place built to remove certainty. Jack stopped short, giving her space, and waited. The waiting mattered. He had learned that rushing was just another way to demand control. The dog studied him, then settled, choosing stillness over challenge, and something in the room loosened. A supervisor stood nearby with a clipboard, flanked by a behavior specialist Jack had not met before, a woman who spoke little and observed much, her presence precise rather than warm. They asked Jack to repeat what had become routine, to move closer, to speak a simple cue. Jack hesitated, not from doubt, but from respect for what the moment could become. He spoke once, voice low and even. The dog responded immediately, not flinching, not testing, aligning herself with a clarity that felt earned rather than enforced. Jack felt the familiar tightening in his chest give way to focus, the same calm that used to arrive when a team moved as one. The specialist made a note. The supervisor cleared his throat. They asked Jack to step back and observe while a staff member entered the enclosure. Jack complied, though every instinct in him wanted to remain where he was. The staff member moved carefully, following protocol, and the dog tracked the movement with restraint that bordered on patience. When the staff member reached for a piece of equipment, metal clinked against concrete, sharp and sudden, and Jack felt the echo of a blast that was not there. His jaw set. He stayed where he was. The dog startled, muscles coiling for an instant. Then she looked to Jack, checking the line they had drawn together. Jack did not move. He did not speak. He simply breathed. The moment passed. The room exhaled as one. The staff member withdrew. No incident. The supervisor's pen paused mid-air. They asked Jack to join them in the office. The walk there felt longer than it was, every step heavy with implication. Inside, the door closed softly, and the supervisor spoke plainly, shedding the careful distance that had defined earlier conversations. They acknowledged the dog's responsiveness, her ability to regulate when Jack was present, and the contrast with her baseline behavior in isolation. The behavior specialist explained trauma in terms that did not soften its edges, describing patterns of hypervigilance, resource guarding, and conditioned response, all without judgment. Jack listened, recognizing himself in the language more than he expected. The supervisor then laid out an option, one that existed in policy but rarely in practice, a rehabilitation pathway designed for cases where conventional placement failed, but risk could be mitigated through a specific bond. The program required a handler with documented experience under stress, someone capable of consistency without coercion, someone willing to assume full responsibility. Jack understood the words as soon as they were spoken. He also understood the cost. Liability was not abstract here. It was concrete and personal. Any failure would belong to him alone. The supervisor did not sell it. He did not promise success. He simply explained the conditions and waited. Jack asked one question, the only one that mattered to him. Would the dog remain alive if he declined? The answer was careful and honest, shaped by timelines and thresholds that did not bend easily. Jack felt the old anger rise, not at the people in the room, but at systems that measured life by acceptable margins. He pushed the anger down and reached for something steadier. He asked for time. They gave him an hour. Jack returned to the enclosure and sat outside it, back against the wall, eyes on the floor until his breathing slowed. He thought about the contract he would be signing, about the way responsibility closed doors, even as it opened one. He thought about the taxi, about the nights he had driven without destination, and about how easy it would be to keep doing that. He thought about the look the dog had given him when the metal rang out, the choice she had made to trust instead of escalate. Jack realized then that the question was not whether he was capable of the work. It was whether he was willing to stop pretending that distance was safety. When he stood and returned to the office, the decision felt less like courage and more like alignment. He agreed. Paperwork followed, dense and unforgiving. Jack read it all, every clause a reminder that intentions did not protect outcomes. He signed anyway. The supervisor nodded once, not approving, not congratulating, simply acknowledging a line crossed. When Jack returned to the enclosure after, the dog rose and approached the boundary, posture calm, eyes intent. Jack knelt and spoke her name for the first time, not loud, not ceremonial, just enough to anchor it between them. She listened, accepting the sound as part of the work ahead. The specialist watched from the door and wrote something down. Outside, the city moved on, unaware of the small, irreversible shift that had just taken place. Jack left the facility with copies of forms under his arm and a weight on his shoulders that felt strangely familiar. It was the weight of a mission accepted, not because it promised redemption, but because walking away would have been a lie he could no longer afford to tell himself. Sometimes miracles do not arrive with thunder or fire from the sky. Sometimes they arrive quietly on a cold night when a broken soul chooses not to walk away. Jack thought his life ended when the war took everything he loved, but God was not finished with him yet. Through a wounded dog, through a storm of snow, through one simple choice to stay, God showed him that what feels broken can still be used for good. In our daily lives, we often believe our pain disqualifies us from purpose. We tell ourselves we are too tired, too damaged, too late. But faith teaches us something different, that God specializes in using scars as tools and loss as preparation. You may not see it today, but the very thing that hurts you most might be what God will use to save someone else tomorrow. If this story touched your heart, take a moment to share it with someone who may be walking through their own storm. Leave a comment below and tell us where you're watching from and what this story meant to you. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories of hope, courage, and the quiet miracles God places in ordinary lives. Let us pray together. Heavenly Father, we ask you to watch over every person listening right now. Comfort those who feel alone, strengthen those who are tired, and remind us that no life is beyond redemption. Send light into dark places and loyal companions to broken hearts. May your peace rest upon every home and every soul watching today. Amen.